Hello there. Hello, how are you? How are you? She reads a lot, and Ali, and then another Ali, a new Ali. Maybe you've been here before, Ali. If you have, I'm sorry, I haven't seen your name before. My name's Gildart, and this is Fireside Reading, and we have a lovely group of people who join us every day to sit and read a chapter of a book together. Very simple, just like the old days. We just sit in front of the fire and read a book together. And the last 2 days have been harrowing because 2 days ago, Laura Fairley died in The Woman in White. And yesterday we found out that she hadn't really died, which is very satisfying because I was very upset by that. I saw one of the notes. Gina noted that she knew but didn't tell us. Thank you for not telling us, Gina. This is a great book. I'm really, really enjoying it. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. And we are now back to Walter Hartwright, the young man who started telling the story again. We are in what is called the third epoch of the novel. And we've gone through all the tribulations of him being a drawing master and going and meeting Laura and her sister Marion. And then she was engaged to Sir Percival Glyde, so he couldn't fall in love with her. He went off to go on board a ship as the drawing master of the ship. And had some adventures that we don't really know about, but we might find out soon a little bit about that. And Laura got married to the dreadful Sir Percival Glyde, who only wanted her money and even talked about possibly killing her with, or it seemed like they were talking about that, with his best friend Count Fosco, the Italian nobleman. Well, it turns out that we thought Laura had died, but she's not dead. She meets Walter when he goes on a pilgrimage to her grave. She is there with Marion. It was very satisfying. Now let's find out what happens next. Welcome to a fireside reading of The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Reading 51. The third epoch. The story continued by Walter Hartwright. 1. I open a new page. I advance my narrative by 1 week. The history of the interval which I thus pass over must remain unrecorded. My heart turns faint. My mind sinks in darkness and confusion when I think of it. This must not be if I who write am to guide, as I ought you who read. This must not be if the clue that leads through the windings of the story is to remain from end to end untangled in my hands. A life suddenly changed, its whole purpose created afresh, its hopes and fears, its struggles, its interests and its sacrifices, all turned at once and forever into a new direction. This is the prospect which now opens before me, like the burst of view from a mountain's top. I left my narrative in the quiet shadow of Limmeridge Church. I resume it 1 week later, in the stir and turmoil of a London street. The street is in a populous and a poor neighbourhood. The ground floor of one of the houses in it is occupied by a small news vendor's shop, and the first floor and the second are let as furnished lodgings of the humblest kind. I have taken these 2 floors in an assumed name. On the upper floor I live, with a room to work in, a room to sleep in. On the lower floor, under the same assumed name, 2 women live, who are described as my sisters. I get my bread by drawing and engraving on wood for the cheap periodicals. My sisters are supposed to help me by taking in a little needlework. Our poor place of abode, our humble calling, our assumed relationship, and our assumed name are all used alike as a means of hiding us in the house forest of London. We are numbered no longer with the people whose lives are open and known. I am an obscure, unnoticed man, without patron or friend to help me. Marian Holcombe is nothing now but my eldest sister, who provides for our household wants by the toil of her own hands. We, too, in the estimation of others, are at once the dupes and the agents of a daring imposture. We are supposed to be the accomplices of mad Anne Catherick, who claims the name, the place, and the living personality of dead Lady Glyde. That is our situation. That is the changed aspect in which we three must appear henceforth in this narrative for many and many a page to come. In the eye of reason and of law, in the estimation of relatives and friends, according to every received formality of civilized society, Laura Lady Glyde lay buried with her mother in Limmeridge churchyard, torn in her own lifetime from the list of the living, the daughter of Philip Fairley and the wife of Percival Glyde, might still exist for her sister, might still exist for me, but to all the world besides, she was dead. Dead to her uncle, who had renounced her, dead to the servants of the house, who had failed to recognize her, dead to the persons in authority, who had transmitted her fortune to her husband and her aunt, dead to my mother and my sister, who believed me to be the dupe of an adventuress and the victim of a fraud, socially, morally, legally, dead. And yet, alive. Alive in poverty and in hiding. Alive with the poor drawing master to fight her battle and to win the way back for her to her place in the world of living beings. Did no suspicion excited by my own knowledge of Anne Catherick's resemblance to her cross my mind when her face was first revealed to me? Not the shadow of a suspicion from the moment when she lifted her veil by the side of the inscription which recorded her death. Before the sun of that day had set, before the last glimpse of the home which was closed against her had passed from our view, the farewell words I spoke when we parted at Limmeridge House had been recalled by both of us, repeated by me, recognized by her, if ever the time comes when the devotion of my whole heart and soul and strength will give you a moment's happiness or spare you a moment's sorrow, will you try to remember the poor drawing master who has taught you? She, who now remembered so little of the trouble and terror of a later time, remembered those words, and laid her poor head innocently and trustingly on the bosom of the man who had spoken them. In that moment, when she called me by my name, when she said, "They have tried to make me forget everything, Walter, but I remember Marian, and I remember you." In that moment, I, who had long since given her my love, gave her my life, and thanked God that it was mine to bestow on her. Yes, the time had come. From thousands on thousands of miles away, through forest and wilderness, where companions stronger than I had fallen by my side, through peril of death, thrice renewed and thrice escaped, the hand that leads me on the dark road to the future had led me to meet that time. Forlorn and disowned, sorely tried and sadly changed, her beauty faded, her mind clouded. Robbed of her station in the world, of her place among living creatures, the devotion I had promised, the devotion of my whole heart and soul and strength, might be laid blamelessly now at those dear feet. In the right of her calamity, in the right of her friendlessness, she was mine at last. Mine to support, to protect, to cherish, to restore. Mine to love and honor as father and brother both. Mine to vindicate through all risks and all sacrifices, through the hopeless struggle against rank and power, through the long fight with armed deceit and fortified success, through the waste of my reputation, through the loss of my friends, through the hazard of my life. 2. My position is defined. My motives are acknowledged. The story of Marion and the story of Laura must come next. I shall relate both narratives, not in the words, often interrupted, often inevitably confused, of the speakers themselves, but in the words of the brief, plain, studiously simple abstract which I committed to writing for my own guidance and for the guidance of my legal adviser. So the tangled web will be most speedily and most intelligibly unrolled. The story of Marion begins where the narrative of the housekeeper at Blackwater Park left off. On Lady Glyde's departure from her husband's house, the fact of that departure and the necessary statement of the circumstances under which it had taken place were communicated to Miss Holcombe by the housekeeper. It was not till some days afterwards, how many days exactly Mrs. Mitchelson, in the absence of any written memorandum on the subject, could not undertake to say, that a letter arrived from Madame Fosco announcing Lady Glyde's sudden death in Count Fosco's house. The letter avoided mentioning dates, and left it to Mrs. Mitchelson's discretion to break the news at once to Miss Holcombe, or to defer doing so until that lady's health should be more firmly established. Having consulted Mr. Dawson, who had been himself delayed by ill health in resuming his attendance at Blackwater Park, Mrs. Mitchelson, by the doctor's advice and in the doctor's presence, communicated the news, either on the day when the letter was received or on the day after. It is not necessary to dwell here upon the effect which the intelligence of Lady Glyde's sudden death produced on her sister. It is only useful to the present purpose to say that she was not able to travel for more than 3 weeks afterwards. At the end of that time, she proceeded to London, accompanied by the housekeeper. They parted there, Mrs. Mitchelson previously informing Miss Holcombe of her address, in case they might wish to communicate at a future period. On parting with the housekeeper, Miss Holcombe went at once to the office of Messrs. Gilmore and Curl to consult with the latter gentleman in Mr. Gilmore's absence. She mentioned to Mr. Curl that she had thought it desirable to conceal from... She mentioned to Mr. Curl what she had thought it desirable to conceal from everyone else, Mrs. Mitchelson included, her suspicion of the circumstances under which Lady Glyde was said to have met her death. Mr. Curl, who had previously given friendly proof of his anxiety to serve Miss Holcombe, at once undertook to make such inquiries as the delicate and dangerous nature of the investigation proposed to him would permit. To exhaust this part of the subject before going farther, it may be mentioned that Count Fosco offered every facility to Mr. Curl, on that gentleman's stating that he was sent by Miss Holcombe to collect such particulars as had not yet reached her of Lady Glyde's decease. Mr. Curl was placed in communication with the medical man, Mr. Goodrick, and with the two servants. In the absence of any means of ascertaining the exact date of Lady Glyde's departure from Blackwater Park, the result of the doctor's and the servants' evidence and of the volunteered statements of Count Fosco and his wife was conclusive to the mind of Mr. Curl. He could only assume that the intensity of Miss Holcomb's suffering under the loss of her sister had misled her judgment in a most deplorable manner. And he wrote her word that the shocking suspicion to which she had alluded in his presence was, in his opinion, destitute of the smallest fragment of foundation in truth. Thus the investigation by Mr. Gilmore's partner began and ended. Meanwhile, Miss Holcomb had returned to Limmeridge House and had there collected all the additional information which she was able to obtain. Mr. Fairley had received his first intimation of his niece's death from his sister, Madame Fosco, this letter also not containing any exact reference to dates. He had sanctioned his sister's proposal that the deceased lady should be laid in her mother's grave in Limmeridge courtyard. Count Fosco had accompanied the remains to Cumberland and had attended the funeral at Limmeridge, which took place on the 30th of July. It was followed, as a mark of respect, by all the inhabitants of the village and the neighbourhood. On the next day, the inscription, originally drawn out, it was said, by the aunt of the deceased lady and submitted for approval to her brother, Mr. Fairley, was engraved on one side of the monument over the tomb. On the day of the funeral, and for one day after it, Count Fosco had been received as a guest at Limmeridge House, but no interview had taken place between Mr. Fairley and himself by the former gentleman's desire. They had communicated by writing, and through this medium Count Fosco had made Mr. Fairley acquainted with the details of his niece's last illness and death. The letter presenting this information added no new facts to the facts already known, but one very remarkable paragraph was contained in the postscript. It referred to Anne Catherick. The substance of the paragraph in question was as follows. It first informed Mr. Fairley that Anne Catherick, of whom he might hear full particulars from Miss Holcomb when she reached Limmeridge, had been traced and recovered in the neighbourhood of Blackwater Park, and had been for the second time placed under the charge of the medical man from whose custody she had once escaped. This was the first part of the postscript. The second part warned Mr. Fairley that Anne Catherick's mental malady had been aggravated by her long freedom from control, and that the insane hatred and distrust of Sir Percival Glyde, which had been one of her most marked delusions in former times, still existed under a newly acquired form. The unfortunate woman's last idea in connection with Sir Percival was the idea of annoying and distressing him, and of elevating herself, as she supposed, in the estimation of the patients and nurses, by assuming the character of his deceased wife. The scheme of this personation having evidently occurred to her after a stolen interview which she had succeeded in obtaining with Lady Glyde, and at which she had observed the extraordinary accidental likeness between the deceased lady and herself. It was to the last degree improbable that she would succeed a second time in escaping from the asylum, but it was just possible she might find some means of annoying the late Lady Glyde's relatives with letters, and in that case Mr. Fairley was warned beforehand how to receive them. The postscript, expressed in these terms, was shown to Miss Holcomb when she arrived at Limmeridge. There were also placed in her possession the clothes Lady Glyde had worn. and the other effects she had brought with her to her aunt's house. They had been carefully collected and sent to Cumberland by Madame Fosco. Such was the posture of affairs when Miss Holcombe reached Limmeridge in the early part of September. Shortly afterwards, she was confined to her room by a relapse, her weakened physical energies giving way under the severe mental affliction from which she was now suffering. On getting stronger again, in a month's time, her suspicion of the circumstances described as attending her sister's death still remained unshaken. She had heard nothing in the interim of Sir Percival Glyde, but letters had reached her from Madame Fosco, making the most affectionate inquiries on the part of her husband and herself. Instead of answering these letters, Miss Holcombe caused the house in St. John's Wood and the proceedings of its inmates to be privately watched. Nothing doubtful was discovered. The same result attended the next investigations, which were secretly instituted on the subject of Mrs. Rubel. She had arrived in London about 6 months before with her husband. They had come from Lyon, and they had taken a house in the neighbourhood of Leicester Square to be fitted up as a boarding house for foreigners who were expected to visit England in large numbers to see the exhibition in 1851. Nothing was known against husband and wife in the neighbourhood. They were quiet people, and they had paid their way honestly up to the present time. The final inquiries related to Sir Percival Glyde. He was settled in Paris and living there quietly in a small circle of English and French friends. Foiled at all points, but still not able to rest, Miss Holcombe next determined to visit the asylum in which she then supposed Anne Catherick to be for the second time confined. She had felt a strong curiosity about the woman in former days, and she was now doubly interested, first in ascertaining whether the report of Anne Catherick's attempted personation of Lady Glyde was true, and secondly, if it proved to be true, in discovering for herself what the poor creature's real motives were for attempting the deceit. Although Count Fosco's letter to Mr. Fairley did not mention the address of the asylum, that important omission cast no difficulties in Miss Holcombe's way. When Mr. Hartright had met Anne Catherick at Limmeridge, she had informed him of the locality in which the house was situated, and Miss Holcombe had noted down the direction in her diary, with all the other particulars of the interview exactly as she heard them from Mr. Hartright's own lips. Accordingly, she looked back at the entry and extracted the address, furnished herself with the Count's letter to Mr. Fairley as a species of credential which might be useful to her, and started by herself for the asylum on the 11th of October. She passed the night of the 11th in London. It had been her intention to sleep at the house inhabited by Lady Glyde's old governess, but Mrs. Vesey's agitation at the sight of her lost pupil's nearest and dearest friend was so distressing that Miss Holcombe considerately refrained from remaining in her presence, and removed to a respectable boarding-house in the neighbourhood recommended by Mrs. Vesey's married sister. The next day she proceeded to the asylum, which was situated not far from London, on the northern side of the metropolis. She was immediately admitted to see the proprietor. At first he appeared to be decidedly unwilling to let her communicate with his patient, but on her showing him the postscript to Count Fosco's letter, on her reminding him that she was the Miss Holcombe there referred to, that she was a near relative of the deceased Lady Glyde, and that she was therefore naturally interested, for family reasons, in observing for herself the extent of Anne Catherick's delusion in relation to her late sister, the tone and manner of the owner of the asylum altered, and he withdrew his objections. He probably felt that a continued refusal, under those circumstances, would not only be an act of discourtesy in itself, but would also imply that the proceedings in his establishment were not of a nature to bear investigation by respectable strangers. Miss Holcomb's own impression was that the owner of the asylum had not been received into the confidence of Sir Percival and the Count. His consenting at all to let her visit his patient seemed to afford one proof of this, and his readiness in making admissions, which could scarcely have escaped the lips of an accomplice, certainly appeared to furnish another. For example, in the course of the introductory conversation which took place, he informed Miss Holcomb that Anne Catherick had been brought back to him with the necessary order and certificates by Count Fosco on the 27th of July. The Count also producing a letter of explanations and instructions, signed by Sir Percival Glyde. On receiving his inmate again, the proprietor of the asylum acknowledged that he had observed some curious personal changes in her. Such changes, no doubt, were not without precedent in his experience of persons mentally afflicted. Insane people were often at one time outwardly as well as inwardly unlike what they were at another. The change from better to worse or from worse to better in the madness having a necessary tendency to produce alterations of appearance externally. He allowed for these, and he allowed also for the modification in the form of Anne Catherick's delusion, which was reflected, no doubt, in her manner and expression. But he was still perplexed at times by certain differences between his patient before she had escaped and his patient since she had been brought back. Those differences were too minute to be described. He could not say, of course, that she was absolutely altered in height or shape or complexion, or in the colour of her hair and eyes, or in the general form of her face. The change was something that he felt more than something that he saw. In short, the case had become a puzzle from the first, and one more perplexity was added to it now. It cannot be said that this conversation led to the result of even partially preparing Miss Holcomb's mind for what was to come. But it produced nevertheless a very serious effect upon her. She was so completely unnerved by it that some little time elapsed before she could summon composure enough to follow the proprietor of the asylum to that part of the house in which the inmates were confined. On inquiry, it turned out that the supposed Anne Catherick was then taking exercise in the grounds attached to the establishment. One of the nurses volunteered to conduct Miss Holcomb to the place, the proprietor of the asylum remaining in the house for a few minutes to attend to a case which required his services, and then engaging to join his visitor in the grounds. The nurse led Miss Holcomb to a distant part of the property, which was prettily laid out, and after looking about her a little, turned into a turf walk, shaded by a shrubbery on either side. About halfway down this walk, two women were slowly approaching. The nurse pointed to them and said, "There is Anne Catherick, ma'am, with the attendant who waits on her. The attendant will answer any questions you wish to put." With those words, the nurse left her to return to the duties of the house. Miss Holcomb advanced on her side, and the women advanced on theirs. When they were within a dozen paces of each other, one of the women stopped for an instant, looked eagerly at the strange lady, shook off the nurse's grasp on her, and the next moment rushed into Miss Holcomb's arms. In that moment, Miss Holcomb recognized her sister, recognized the dead alive. Thank you all for joining me. We will finish that chapter tomorrow. Not tomorrow. No, there's no reading tomorrow. Tomorrow is Friday. Yes, no reading tomorrow, but we will read on Saturday. And thereafter, every day at 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram. So have a lovely Friday, everyone, and I will see you on Saturday. And until then, stay very, very well.